Okay, I'm back. Yesterday I was reading chapter 8 of Pete Walker's book, which is not, I've got another book I read from. It's Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, but, excuse me, my microphone. What I'm going to read from today is the Tao of Fully feeling. Yesterday I read part of chapter 8, and I'm going to continue. So if you want to catch up, the video yesterday was half an hour, and it was the beginning of this chapter, which is really useful. I'm just going to turn down my sound so I don't get feedback. Really useful when we are trying to heal complex PTSD or understand it, that what we need to get to is a point of but knowing that we have some power via psychoeducation to get to a point of when we go through flashbacks or fight, flight, freeze response, we know what to do. So we don't spiral out of control and we begin to get our lives under some sort of control. So what can I do here? So what I'm doing, if anybody joins, then I'm happy to, you can comment in the comments box, for instance. If you've got any comments, and I'm also over on Facebook where you can private message me, because clearly, talking about child abuse and having had that is not something many people want to hold their hands up to, because society is so against the fact that, people, the whole forgiveness thing, and people say we should forgive our parents and that we should be over it. And there are many people walking around in traumatized state, hiding the truth of what happened to them because society currently is still not quite there and understanding the pain that people have. So the inner critic is something that needs to be dealt with in complex PTSD. And through, as I said, psychoeducation, we begin to heal. And a lot of our experiences as adults are reflected, they come from, like when our lives are not together and we don't understand what's going on, we can really give ourselves a hard time and be very unkind to ourselves. And it's hard for many people to overcome it because they think they've got anxiety. If I'm making sense, a lot of people think they're suffering from just anxiety and they're not putting two and two together. They're not realizing that a lot of these panic attacks and anxiety are actually coming from unresolved, unheard childhood trauma and memories. So what I'm going to do is read a bit from the book, and if anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to, look on occasion and see if there are any. So I'm going to read chapter 8 on verbal abuse, because there are different types of abuse, but generally in child abuse, there are, people can think that verbal abuse isn't as bad as sexual abuse, or physical abuse is not as bad as sexual abuse. But as a child, all types of abuse are the same. A child is a child. So any type of abuse is not, one can't say one is worse than the other when it comes to children, clearly. Okay, so verbal abuse. Pete Walker says, verbal abuse is the use of language to shame, scare, or hurt another. Dysfunctional parents routinely use name-calling, sarcasm, and destructive criticism to overpower and control their children. Verbal abuse is as commonplace in the American family as homework and table manners. It is modeled as socially acceptable in almost every sitcom or on television. The following time-worn castigations may sound familiarly painful to you. For instance, how did I wind up with such a crummy kid? No one likes you. You are good for nothing. You good for nothing little brat. Only selfish little ingrate would do that. Having you was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I can't stand the sight of you. You'll never amount to anything. You make me sick. You're rotten through and through. When this kind of undercutting talk is habitual, it alone destroys a child's self-esteem. When language carries threats, it is even more abusive and destructive. The following admonishments are also common parlance in many dysfunctional families. If you don't do what I say, I will never talk to you again. If you don't wipe that expression off your face, I'll wipe it off for you. If you don't eat your peas, you're going to get nothing for Christmas. He continues saying, I had one unfortunate client who, for the crime of forgetting to make her bed one day, was given a piece of coal on her 5th Christmas. When children are addressed frequently in such ways, they are forced to live in fear as well as toxic shame. Verbal abuse is quite different from constructive criticism. Statements like, hitting your sister is not okay, or I don't like it when you call me names, and if you don't do your homework, you're not going to be able to go out to play, are not verbal abuse. Parents owe it to their children to correct behaviours and that are harmful to them or others. This duty can readily be accomplished in many ways that are not abusive or shaming and point out the behaviour is bad, not the child. Unfortunately, many survivors grew up in families in which criticism was not constructive. Not only was criticism destructive, but it was also inaccurate and presented itself as if it were a scientific fact. Many survivors still believe and cling to negative parental appraisals, regardless of how much objective evidence there is to the contrary. I frequently hear very intelligent, accomplished survivors inaccurately disparaging themselves with their parents' brandings of stupid and worthless. So, for instance, if you went through years and years of abuse, whether it was, aunts, uncles, whoever it was, brothers, siblings, sisters, if you've been put down and you've been through abuse, it means that you grow up and you'll take on that voice in your head. And the inner critic will use that voice because we're sponges when we're children. So one thing that I heard growing up, whenever I was I was going through trauma, when I was in need and I wanted to be nurtured, often what I was confronted with was, what's wrong with you, child? When a parent does that to a child, when they need nurturing, it means that we take on that voice, and the inner critic can berate us and make us feel really, really, it gives us really low self-esteem. So we live our adult lives making really bad choices and not being able to stand up for ourselves because we've got this voice that won't go away. A lot of Pete Walker's work, the book Complex Ptsd from Surviving to Thriving, he's got a list on the inner critic. And the inner critic is that constant voice in our heads, and we've all got one. I would say even people that have not been through, sexual abuse or violence or verbal abuse still have that, am I good enough? Am I pretty enough? Am I clever enough? Or the voice telling them that they're stupid and there's something wrong with them. But it's deeply ingrained in people that have been through sexual abuse and violence and, traumatic childhood. So I'm going to continue reading. And the reason I'm putting this psychoeducation out there is because a lot of people, and myself, I did it myself, go into disassociation and start using things. Like I used alcohol and cigarettes to, not feel. Some people will use food. Some people will eat too much, and some people will not eat at all. They won't eat enough. And some people are self-harming. And there are many things that people do, and also getting into codependent relationships that are really unhealthy, where you're not being loved and you're not being nurtured and you just accept it. So there's a huge knock-on effect from childhood abuse that if we don't get to healthy anger and healthy blame as adults, then we don't move it. It stays with us, until we leave this planet. So it's there's going to be below this video the book that I'm reading here, Complex PTSD book as well, Pete Walker, and a list of 14 steps for your inner critic, and also 13 steps for managing flashbacks. So a lot of people will have panic attacks and social anxiety, and often people will go to the doctor. The real issues will not often be discussed. A lot of people can't afford therapy. If in the UK, we're able to get therapy on the NHS, which is our national health system. But again, it can be a wait list of up to 9 months, and you've got to qualify for it. So even if people do go, they may not get it. So I got my therapy through my doctor. So I'm having psychoanalysis once a week, and I'm halfway through a year and a half. And it's really helping me because I've been able to verbal ventilate. I've been able to healthy anger and get to seeing how, tragic it was for me. Like I'm realizing, and that's helping me to bloom and become the person, become whole, because I'm not in denial anymore of how painful, it was for me. And we've got to not bypass, a lot of bypassing in spirituality where you forgive and you let go, that flies around. I tried that as well. I tried the forgiving and letting go and handing it over to God, so to speak, as people do in spirituality. That did not work. CPTSD is the more severe form of PTSD. PTSD is like a one-off event, somebody's at war, as an example, and they lose somebody or they see some horrific event, and that disturbs them for the rest of their lives without having therapy. With CPTSD, it's complex because it's abuse over many years or events that are so painful. And if a child is not heard or listened to, then they become loners. They go inward and become loners. So there's a lot more to healing, but it starts with psychoeducation and actually understanding what's going on. So I'm going to continue reading next on emotional abuse here. So Pete Walker says here that verbal abuse is often different from constructive criticism. I think I read that bit. Unfortunately, many survivors grew up in families in which criticism was not constructive. Not only was criticism destructive, but it was often inaccurate and presented as if it was a scientific fact. Many survivors still believe and cling to negative parental appraisals, regardless of how much objective evidence there is to the contrary. Then I'll go on. He says, emotional abuse is the use of feelings to shame, scare, or hurt another. The parent who screams and yells with rage at her child is being emotionally abusive. She is dumping her anger and frustration on the child. When children are continuously sullied with their parents' anger, sadness, depression, and fear, they get a bad taste for these emotions. This adds to their fear of these feelings in themselves and in others. They grow up to be adults who go to extraordinary lengths to avoid feeling or expressing their emotions. The parent who manipulates by withdrawing from his child in pouting, angry silence also commits emotional abuse. He is emotionally blackmailing his child through abandonment and through evoking guilt and fear to gain more absolute control over her. Emotional incest is yet another form of emotional abuse. Emotional incest commonly involves the reversal of the parent-child roles. When this occurs, the mother or father parentifies the child, who is then manipulated to gratify the unmet childhood needs of the parent. This typically manifests as the parent pumping the child for an unconditional love that she should herself be giving. He says, Patricia Love has written a very helpful book on this subject called The Emotional Incest Syndrome. Emotional incest also occurs when a parent transforms his child into a confidant and uses her as a sounding board for all his concerns and problems. Alice Miller's book explains how easy it is for parents to seduce a child into this kind of relationship. Reading on, he says, a newborn baby is completely dependent on his parents, and since their caring is essential for his existence, he does all he can to avoid losing them. From the very first day onward, he will muster all his resources to this end, like a small plant that turns towards the sun in order to survive. So you can see that with newborn babies, they're so attached to their parent from day one. So if somebody has two parents that are both abusive, then it is disaster. No nurture and abuse from two parents. If we've got one good parent and one bad parent, it's still not good enough. But and then we don't get the nurture and the love, and then it can lead to other things. If it can lead to sexual abuse, it can lead to violence. And if one parent is pretty good and the other one is really tragically bad in treatment, it's still bad. I don't know what to say. I mean, I think we know the reality. If I'm not getting lost here, I'm going to continue reading with this. I haven't got any, I can see 3 viewers. So If you want to ask any questions on this, or visit me on my Facebook page, on the links below as well. And if you know anybody who might need this, please pass it on to them, because there's not enough psychoeducation out there. People are going to the doctors and getting, anxiety pills, and being given anxiety pills for what really is, anxiety that's coming from childhood unresolved trauma. And only we know that. We have to look back and see, what was our childhood like, and why are we suffering now as adults? And are we abusing ourselves with alcohol or overeating or whatever else that we do to protect ourselves? So he says here, the deadly duo of verbal and emotional abuse. He says here, verbal and emotional abuse are often perpetrated at one and the same time. Unfair, angry criticism is the example of this. As the criticism is not only destructive in the meaning, but also charged with hurtful emotion, anger and disgust in a parent's tone of voice makes the child feel that he is essentially bad and unlovable. And we can see here, when this happens to children, they'll start fawning, they'll be extra nice to their parents, so their parents will not, will be nice to them. And that means as adults, we take that into adulthood. And if we have meet a partner who's narcissistic or abusive, instead of standing up for ourselves, we'll go into a fawn, which means, we'll be extra nice and polite, trying to get this person to be nice to us. We'll carry out the same sort of behavior that we've had as children into our adult relationships. So many disastrous adult relationships happen because people don't have the self-esteem to say, hey, that's not acceptable. I don't like being spoken to like that. Or we don't have the skills to resolve, the problems that we're having in relationships. We don't have the healthy boundaries. That's what I'm trying to say. So continuing reading, he says, the tone of voice is often the vehicle by which emotions are delivered. And I will say there, if you can go back, if you've been through child abuse, you might have that tone of voice in your head that was given you. Like for me, what's wrong with you, child? That tone of voice, when I hear that now when I hear myself repeating that or saying that, I tell it to bugger off. I knock it out of the way. So inner critic work is really essential in order to healing. That's the first thing we have to do when we've been through abuse as children, get rid of the inner critic. And it's a consistent work until it really begins to dissipate. So tone of voice is often the vehicle by which emotions are delivered. Tone of voice alone can be very abusive. Of course, we love you. Of course, we love you can be uttered in an emotionally venomous way, even though the words themselves are not abusive. Some matriarch mothers could intone, I only want you to be happy. You've probably heard this if you've been through abuse, when people have been abusive to you, your parents or family, and then they've turned around and said, I only want you to be happy, in a way that would make a saint or sociopath feel guilty. The use of tone to emotionally intimidate is usually the exclusive right of parents. What adult child does not remember being scolded with the retort, how dare you talk to me like that, in that tone of voice? Yet, who among us was ever allowed to protest that same tone in our parents' voices? Destructive words paired with emotions of anger or disgust force children to contract in fear and toxic shame. When this happens on a daily basis, children suffer so intensely that they may be driven into early drug and alcohol abuse, mental illness, or even suicide, even in families that are not physically abusive. This is important to note because so many survivors recoil at sympathy for the verbal and emotional abuse they suffered. They often do this by citing the classic minimization, I had it good compared to others. They never even hit me. Dysfunctional parents often add emotional abuse to verbal abuse by delivering destructive messages with intimidating body language and facial expressions of hate and disgust. It is abusive to scowl at a child with the loathing effect, with skin inflamed with rage and with facial veins bulging in hate. It is abusive to deliver critical messages with clenched fists or with hands pounding on the table. When an adult does this to a child, the child becomes terrified. If he is young enough, this fear may so overwhelm him that he wets his pants like a terrorized puppy. And we've got to see that, like, you know, I've seen it happen to children where people, you know, scream at them like, you know, shut up. I had it in a place I live where a neighbor screamed at their child. And when I heard that neighbor scream at their child, it actually put me into a fight, flight, freeze response. So it's important that we begin to look at our childhood and see where we're not able to manage our adult lives, because a lot of this is coming from childhood. And we can't, you know, when we stop denying it and we get to healthy anger and healthy blame, and we begin to work with our inner critic, then we begin to make healthy choices, and in relationships and in the work we do, and we're able to take better care of ourselves. I'm going to continue reading this last little bit. This isn't going to be a long video. I'm on for probably another 5 minutes or so. So he says, when parents scowl at children as if they are disgusting, they often internalize this as a sense of being ugly, no matter how physically attractive they are. In moments of deep vulnerability in therapy, this is Pete Walker saying, he said, I have heard models and actors and others whom most people would consider beautiful or handsome express great disgust and disappointment in their looks. In my early years as a therapist, this incongruity so perplexed me that I had a hard time taking it seriously. As my denial and minimization about verbal and emotional abuse subsided, I could see more clearly how survivors' self-images were so distorted. When a child is bombarded with critical messages accompanied by a tone of disgust and a facial expression of loathing, she cannot help but believe that she is ugly and unpleasant to look at. When this happens constantly during her formative years, during the years when she is forming her self-image, she is forced to visualize herself as ugly, no matter how beautiful she appears to others. Her self-image becomes so distorted that she can only see ugliness when she looks in the mirror. So I went through that stage of where, you know, self-hatred, and that I wasn't good enough. I mean, I was told some terrible things about myself. And I can see that a lot of parents, you know, they've probably had really crap childhoods themselves, but it goes beyond, it can't be an excuse anymore in society. We can't say, you know, this where we're saying, well, they had it bad, because then we have things like recently in the Catholic Church where many priests have sexually abused children, and we see it in the news and then it disappears. And all of the people that have been through abuse, sexual abuse, would have been highly triggered when those cases came to light. And the cases in Hollywood where, you know, we had that Me Too movement, then we had the Michael Jackson case and the Catholic Church. People who've been through sexual abuse get triggered, but they're not able to go anywhere or complain. And if one's been abused by their parents and then they complain to their friends, they say, oh, you know, it was in the past, you've got to forgive them, they're your parents. And that's coming from people who've not been through sexual abuse or violence. And it's extremely hard for those then that have been through abuse to speak up, because they're shut down immediately. So if you're watching this and you've not been through any abuse and you've had a really great childhood and really decent parents, know that telling people that have been through horrific abuse as children to forgive is really, it's a triggering thing to do. It's like, I'll give an example. If somebody's is raped, you wouldn't tell them to forgive the person that raped them. It's a really stupid thing to do if you think about it, because it's triggering. You know, when we've got no control over how we've been abused or who we've been abused by, we need support. And as Pete Walker says, the records are one in 3 girls, sexual abuse, violence, violations as children, 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 5 boys. There's 7.5 billion of us on planet Earth. That's probably more than half the population of people who've been through trauma. And when people have the courage to speak up and we're heard, it means that we're saving this happening to children in the future. So it's not only our own healing, that when we speak up, we're changing the world. We're changing the world and the way people see things about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable to say. It is safe to speak up. You know, there are groups on Facebook. If you want to know, if you're not in any groups on Facebook that deal with these things, then you can private message me and over on Facebook, and I can put you in touch with those groups where there's support and there's understanding and there's respect and caring as well. So where am I at this book? Okay, I hope I'm not repeating a bit of this here, but I'm going to go for it. He says, in my early years as a therapist, okay, the combination of verbal and emotional abuse is the most lethal weapon used in the destruction of a children's self-esteem. When children are continuously assaulted in this way, they eventually become numb and get used to being degraded. When this occurs, denial happens, and children sever the connection with their normal feelings of hurt and anger about verbal hostility. With no access to healthy blame and that normally arises to challenge such attacks, they may unprotestingly put up with the verbal and emotional abuse for the rest of their adult lives. Last little bit here. He says, if they are female, they may even join the ranks of the many women in our culture who brag that they have good marriages because their husbands never hit them. Survivors need to regain their feelings about how much it hurts to be lambasted in critical ways and belligerent tones. If they do not, they risk becoming permanent dumping grounds for other people's anger. I am often struck by the number of people around me who allow significant others to routinely hurt them with an abusive tone of voice or with degenerating remarks. Even when I see them contract and become small and quiet on such occasions, they usually deny my observation that it seems to have really hurt them. I have finally come to realize that they truly believe that it does not, as decades of work in this field have shown me that denial is an incomparable filter for screening out painful input that is or seems to be uncontestable. So I'm going to leave it there today on this book, and I'm going to continue with chapter 8 tomorrow, because the psychoeducation required to heal is needed. It's not one thing that solves the issue of CPTSD. And there are many modalities out there. Some claim miracle cures. With CPTSD, one can be having nightmares, flashbacks, daily anxiety, palpitations, panic attacks, and not able to sleep at night, general fear of people. And, for instance, I had a very bad experience in the park once that was really unfortunate that happened to me. And now if I go to a little park and I sit on my own, I'm looking over my shoulder, so we need to not deny what's happened to us, and we need to be able to voice it to another human being, if it's a friend who gets us, a therapist, or in groups on Facebook. And when we voice and we have a witness to our wounding, and we can say that really hurt what happened to me, and we can cry, healthy anger and tears are really, really important in part of the healing process. So we must not stop the flow of tears when they happen. And it's okay for healthy anger, something I did for a while, because I was really enraged when I realized, realized how badly, what a bad hand of cards I'd been dealt with a child. I bought a phone back from a toy shop, and I beat my pillows on my bed. I'd really beat them, really quite severely. So there are many things we can do. I hope that's been helpful. I can see 5 people watching, but I'm going to leave it here for today. And don't be come over and visit me on Facebook if you want to see me more regular on a daily basis. I'm over there. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to end for today. And check out the links below of the things I said, the 13 steps for managing flashbacks, anxiety, panic attacks, and the 14 tips for handling and beginning to get rid of your inner critic, because people who've been through trauma deserve nurture and love, and they deserve to be heard. Okay, thanks for watching.